Why open source and why do people develop for it? Because this is one thing I hear all the time, especially in the Windows realm. A lot of people don't understand. Linux realm, a lot of times they get it, but sometimes they have this fanatical, weird belief system that I just don't quite understand. So I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle between closed source and open source. I kind of use both. It just depends on what's going on. And I kind of want to explain the pros and cons of each and why, as someone that develops stuff on almost a daily basis these days, I really love open source, but I understand it's not for everybody. So let's go ahead, dive into it, and tackle why you'd use open source. So the number one thing for me is it creates a better product. Like when you are doing open source, there's times where you just need collaboration. A good example is this right here. On my notifications, I have a couple people with my toolbox where it's like Developer Derp and Carter. They go back and forth and they find stuff that I would never find. So it's almost like I have extra developers developing, making the program even better that I wouldn't have if I closed sourced it. Like this right here is ridiculous. It's a measuring tool that Carter found, and it's like, hey, if you do this prefix before you do your command, you're going to save more than half the time. Half the time is kind of insane. And when you're doing a ton of different commands, this makes your program twice as fast as if it was closed source. That's kind of a big deal. Also, there's the fact that a lot of times you need a quality control team where you might need to, hey, put this out, and they'll maybe find a couple bugs, but they're never going to find all the bugs. Your users will. And that's another thing about open source, like GitHub issues here. I have just hundreds of issues that pop in, and I can go through them. Some of them are garbage. You know, they're like, hey, it don't work. I don't know why, but it don't work. Please fix. I can't do anything with that. But a lot of times those issues are really specific where they'll be like, hey, there's this, this, and this, and this. And when I do these certain tasks, this bug happens. And I'm like, oh, well, I would have never known that if I didn't get a detailed response. And all that's covered with Git, which is amazing, which is a great tool that anybody that uses open source knows about. But it's not to say open source is perfect and you can just always use it for everything. Like, I get that a company can make way more money if they have a talented team of developers. They can close source all the software, and then they can charge a subscription fee on like a yearly basis. They're going to make a way more money than they ever would with open source. However, without the monetary aspect, if you don't have those things, like I don't consider myself a particularly gifted developer, I would just say that I understand certain things about like PowerShell or Windows because I've been done it for decades, that I can really get a lot of really good insights that most people would miss. But the thing that I would miss the most about open source is the knowledge I gain. That's the thing, is I don't think that I could possibly get as much knowledge as I'm gaining from just learning a measuring command and then looking at that. There's been other times where I'm like looking at like a GUI review and I'm looking at making things better, and someone puts like a XAML commit, and all of a sudden I have tick boxes in my toolbox that I didn't even know existed with XML, which I was like, hey, that's kind of a really cool addition that I never saw when I was using like Visual Studio and mapping out the GUI. I thought that was a really neat thing. So I'm learning all this knowledge, and that knowledge is really valuable on the open market. So if 10 years down the road, I want to make a closed source project and charge a ton of money for it, well, I could, and that project would be way, way better than if I were doing closed source today. So there's a lot of value and knowledge to gain in open source, and that does equate to long-term value for you as an individual. So it's a huge thing. So it just depends on where you're at here. If you're already like a John Carmack and you're just like a super developer, well, I think a blend between the two is perfect. Like how Quake did a blend between open and closed source, where the engine was open source and then the actual content itself of the video game was closed source. That's one of the most successful games of all time, and that's awesome. I think that's great. So I think there's a good mix between the two where you can get a better product at the end, and that's where most people mess up here. So let's go over the myths. Obviously, I'm a proponent of open source. I think everyone should be open source unless you're just wildly gifted and you have a lot of resources and other people to actually collaborate with. But as a solo, I mean, I couldn't see much value in doing closed source other than just money. The knowledge you'd miss by open sourcing a lot of stuff would just be astronomical, in my opinion. So let's talk about some of the closed source myths. Let's shift, put on our fanatic hat, and go over to some of the craziness of the open source community. And kind of tackle some things that I constantly hear about where everyone says everything should be open source. And the first thing I want to talk about is the money. Closed source gives you more money. I can't believe people actually think that you can crowdfund a lot of things and open source it to pay for it. It's just donations are great. I know I'm really appreciative of my Patreon and a lot of my donations I get. I even sell like a little offline executable for my toolbox, which some people find convenient instead of downloading a PowerShell script because it's open source. But at the end of the day, I look at those donations and I'm still part-time here on YouTube on top of what I make from that donation, and I still have a day job. So that should tell you not only am I not making enough to buy more developers, I don't even have enough to fund myself. So that is probably one of the things I want to tackle is crowdfunding and just donation-based programs. While you might think, hey, there must be a lot of good people out there donating to a lot of these projects, the truth is that's not really how it works. You're not going to make probably 100th of the money you would make if it was closed source on like a subscription-based model or just being sold at like a box price of $50. So that's one thing I would just want to tackle from what I found in doing closed and open source. The second myth on the open source community, and I know I'm probably making some folks worked up in the comment section here, but is everything should be open source, everything should be free, so we can review it. And for that, I would say that's just not feasible when you have teams being developed, and some projects require some type of funding through closed source methods. And that's just going to net more money, which might benefit that project long term. Like I said, I think how John Carmack did Quake is like the perfect example of doing some open source where the engine, the actual 3D engine, was all open source, and then the content itself, like the actual maps and things that were drawn by artists, was all closed source. And when you combine both of them together, you got all the benefits from a lot of that open source development, but also you made the money because all the content and packaging was done in a closed source type way. So it's a blend between the two. And I think I would love to see more games take this approach to open source and closed source development for funding and actually getting a lot of the benefit. But many people would look at that and go, well, that's wrong. I can't believe that was closed source. And that's just people that are just cheap and they don't care about the actual funding and paying for it. Those are the folks that wouldn't even donate to the project to begin with. They just want everything for free. So there is that small faction in the open source community where everything should be free and open. And a lot of that is just not justified, in my opinion. And I know that's a weird stance to take where I know I'll probably anger a lot of people, but it's, I think, the correct one after I've looked at it and kind of develop my own stuff over time. And the third myth I hear all the time, and this isn't necessarily from the open source community, this is actually from the closed source community. They actually think that closed source software is more secure and open source software is less secure because the code's open. And that's not how blood bugs work at all. Like, there's CVEs and hacker groups out there. With how AI is going, they're going to find so much more bugs and be able to exploit it for longer because of how closed source development cycles are so long. And open source stuff, well, if there's an issue and it's publicized, well, you're going to be able to close that security bug a lot faster. So you're going to immediately patch because, oh, hey, there's 1,000 people saying, hey, there's this exploit here. you're gonna be more secure, a lot more secure. If you even look at the severity of a lot of the exploits between Windows and, let's say, Linux, where Windows is obviously completely closed source and Linux is completely open source, you can see that most of the Linux bugs were like elevation, local elevation type things, where a lot of the Windows bugs were like remote execution things. So you can look at all that and you're just like, wow, the Windows bugs were just massive and really egregious, where a lot of the Linux stuff is almost nitpicky, where it's like, oh, well, I mean, really? Is someone going to do that from a local terminal or a local console on a Linux server? I mean, yeah, I guess that's a bug. We should probably patch it. But on the Windows side of thing, it's like, hey, you just look at like the ransomware wave of like 2018s and 2019s with people just, hey, it's connected to the internet and you get infected. So that's where, when I look at open source, it's far more secure than anything closed source that I've seen. And the fourth one, which actually has a little bit of a grain of truth that I want to tackle, is it's harder to maintain an open source project compared to a closed source project. The closed source project, there's only a small team of people usually, or maybe even one person, and that is going to be able to develop it almost in a vacuum to where it's going to be easy to maintain and develop for, because that person understands all the code and all the commits, and it's just a little bit easier to maintain is the thought process. And then in the open source realm, you have commits from everywhere. If I look at the contributors just on the toolbox I have, there's over 20, and each one has a different style, a different development comment system. I've had all kinds of different pull requests, from nuke the world to just not commenting properly. Hey, what does this actually do? There's all kinds of craziness that happens in the open source realm. But to say it's harder to maintain is incorrect. I think you need to look at it as I look at the projects where I messed up on, and that was on me accepting a bad pull request or not adhering to standardization that happens in open source. Because at the end of the day, if you're really good with Git and you understand standardization and you go ahead and line all that out in like a rule set, so when a pull request comes through, it goes through your rules, and then, hey, it'll either deny it or just send it out and say, hey, please review this code. You review the code properly, and then you accept the commit, so you get all the benefits. It's maintained, it's standardized, it's got all that stuff that a closed source one, sometimes they might not be very well documented, and that person might leave the company, and then it just falls into a state of limbo because no one understands the code. Well, that doesn't really happen in the open source realm, because you already did all the legwork because you had to. Because if you didn't, it would just turn into a gobbled mess and it would be impossible to maintain. And that's where I can see why people think it's hard to maintain, but in reality, it's actually making you standardize, making you to do those rules, and making you code properly. So I really appreciate this, but I would have to say those first 10 to 20 projects I made in like GitHub with collaborators, oh man, I look back on my Arch Titus that I did a couple years back, I did a video on, and that just turned into a giant mess because I was such a noob when it came to GitHub and accepting too many pull requests and then going, oh no, what did I do to the code? And then I ended up just having to strip most of it out and figure it out, and it's just a mess when you don't do it, where it makes it hard to maintain. But that was on me for accepting stuff before I completely understood the code commits, or they might not have been documented, or I might have been just afraid of hurting someone's feelings because I denied their pull request. And that's where that's the noob to more of a seasoned person would go, okay, let's look at the code. This looks good. This looks good. Nope, this is bad. I'm going to go ahead and make a comment disapproving of the pull request and saying, hey, these changes need to be made. If they don't get made, you close it out and don't accept it. So that's the thing, is not everything that comes in open source is usable, but most things are. And some things just require some tweaking, but it's all about that standardization and comment system. And at the end of the day, for me, it's just knowledge gain. I mean, you get so much knowledge gain with open source that it's just ridiculous. I don't know why any single developer would just choose anything but open source. If you're just learning, or maybe you have 5 to 10 years of programming experience, I think you just stick with open source. Now, when you get to be a seasoned or experienced or a master programmer and you're making some amazing things, yeah, of course, you're going to want to dabble into that closed source realm to monetize it and to feed yourself. But at the same time, it's really interesting on the knowledge you gain. And honestly, some of the programmers just have open source projects going all the time. And I think that's the happy medium, is figuring out, maybe having one or two, semi-closed source projects that actually pay the bills, and then most of everything is open source, so you're constantly gaining that knowledge, gaining that stuff from the open source and the GitHub projects. Because I can't tell you how much I'm just a better programmer, I'm a better scripter, I'm just so many things I've learned from having open source projects, that I encourage everyone to do open source, to just gain that knowledge set. And then once you get some experience, I think closed source is fine. It's just don't jump the shark. Don't make everything closed source. There's too many bad closed source stuff out there. So many utilities in Windows where I look at it, I'm like, I can't believe they charge money for this. There's a better open source program. What a bunch of fools giving away their money to get this one thing that, frankly, already has a better open source alternative. So that's the thing that I always just warn users about. But this is why open source versus closed source, and kind of a blend between the two, is my approach, and why people use open source.